country has left the size of the UK, no country the size of the UK has ever left an economic union like this. So the truthful answer is we simply don't know. Now, the MPs seem to be suggesting there that the rest of the EU nations would give us quite a tough deal because they would like to create a disincentive about other nations taking similar action. But then on the other hand, the rest of the EU wants to trade with us, and we're still, by some measures, the fifth biggest economy in the world. And so really that's one of the unknowns about what would the trade deal, or what would the arrangements more broadly look like afterwards. And that's really very difficult to tell with any honesty. And the first thing is to get a trade deal for goods where the world average tariffs are about 3%. Really, that's not particularly difficult. Of course, it takes a bit of time, but the UK could get a fast deal because trade in goods, tariff is only 3%. We're not arguing about a great deal here. And as you pointed out, Europe has a big surplus with the UK for trading goods. Now, trading services is an altogether different game. There's no comprehensive, in other words, going across all services, trade agreement between any major countries in the world, apart from the European Union. And services happens to be what the UK is good at. So the UK has a surplus of about £21 billion in services. So there, the incentives are different. And the reason why this is difficult, if I can just sort of explain a little bit, is to trade a good. You put the good on a ship or a plane or a car and say goodbye to it. It goes overseas. That's straightforward. To sell a service, quite often, you have to set up an office or a shop in another country because you consume services where they're sold. So like education services, students have to more than often not come to the UK to consume the education services. So we have to allow countries to set up offices and shops in our country, and we have to be able to do it in their country. And to do that requires the same rules, to treat people fairly. And that's where it starts getting complicated. So in summary, the answer to your question, for goods, I think a trade agreement would be very straightforward. For services, I think that would be quite demanding to have anything like the current arrangements we have for trading services. Mm-hmm. It depends on the arrangement that is struck if the UK decides to leave. The UK is a global financial centre. It particularly benefits at the moment because it can do a lot of euro-based business while not using the euro as its currency. Now, why is this the case? One of the reasons is because we're a member of the European Economic Area, we can set up banks in any other European country, and they can set them up in our country without any further authorization than authorization from their own regulator. So it's very, very easy. And therefore, companies in America, Switzerland, and elsewhere around the world put their European headquarters in London because we can easily branch out into the rest of Europe. If that looks like it could be in jeopardy at some point in the future, then there's less incentive for them to put their headquarters in London. That's the longer term threat. In the short term, I think both sides would like to keep things very much as they are. It's over the longer term, whether that's really sustainable, that the UK as a global financial centre accepts the rules from the EU without having a say in setting those rules. That doesn't sound to me like in the long term it's what economists would call a stable equilibrium. I think it would be imprudent of me to estimate just exactly how much the consequences are, but I think that there's a consensus that it would make life more difficult for the city overall. Of course, some areas might benefit, but overall, I think the city would be one of those sectors that will be adversely affected by the UK leaving the EU. no country has ever done this sort of experiment before, so inevitably there's uncertainty and risks. One of them is about the credit rating of the UK government. So several of the rating agencies have said that there's a good chance that the UK sovereign credit rating would be downgraded. I think one of them said twice. So that means UK is a riskier place to lend money to, the UK government. And because the UK government ultimately backs up the banks, then you have to say, well, if the UK government's perceived as slightly riskier, doesn't that make the banks being perceived as slightly riskier? And therefore the banks, for them to borrow money, people might just start charging a little bit more for them to borrow money. And of course, they have to pass that cost on somewhere, and so that's what they're arguing, that there could be slightly tighter conditions. We've also seen at the same time stock prices falling quite significantly. And the other interesting aspect is the amount of lending from European banks now into the UK economy. So a lot of Swedish, Scandinavian, and German small to medium-sized banks do a lot of lending now into our small to medium-sized business sector. And of course, in our mortgages, Santander is a very big lender. Now, that's not to say they're going to stop anytime soon, but it could just mean that they rethink where their assets are going to be based over the long term. And so it's that sort of tightening that I think the OECD has in mind. And I think it's for that reason that the UK and the EU will do everything they can to keep things unchanged in the short term, because nobody wants to see tighter credit. It makes the UK economy worse, and it makes the European economy worse, and that's in nobody's interest. In my view, there are many aspects to think about. I personally don't think it's just an economics question. Economics, I think, is a large part, and it's the part that I'm obviously most interested in as an economist. But there are other issues to consider. There are issues to consider such as security, such as what sort of society people want to live in, such as what sort of powers do they want to have for the UK government. All of these things, I think, need to be taken into consideration, particularly the bigger security issue questions. I think that, being of the younger generation, I think it's those longer term issues which are most important.